Today I'm going to demonstrate how to assemble the torque tube drive system for the Fusion 50. Here we have the required components, including tail boom. In this case it's the orange Outrage tail boom, the torque tube drive ends, socket head cap screws and nylock nuts for attaching the torque tube drive ends, the torque tube bearings and bearing supports. Let's get underway. The first thing I shall do is mark the torque tube for the position of the two bearings. The front bearing is positioned 230 mm from the front end of the torque tube, and the rear bearing is positioned 275 mm from the rear end of the torque tube. First I will mark the position of the front bearing at 230 mm, and next the position of the rear bearing at 275 mm. Next, it is important to clean the torque tube and the inner race of the bearings with your favourite solvent so as the glue works well. In this case I'm using isopropyl alcohol. I like to clean the whole torque tube so that when I slide the bearings on, they don't pick up any residual grease. To clean the inner race of the bearing, I like using a paper towel with isopropyl alcohol on it. Roll the paper towel up into a point, slide the bearing over and gently clean any residual grease off the inner race. Do this with both bearings. Next I will mix some 5-minute epoxy and we'll come back and apply that to the torque tube. I've now mixed a small amount of 5-minute epoxy and we will apply that to the torque tube at the position of our marks. The idea is to have a very thin layer of 5-minute epoxy at the position of the bearings. After applying the 5-minute epoxy, take a bearing, slide it over the end of the torque tube and down to where the epoxy and the mark is. Slide the bearing carefully over the epoxy and then just back a few millimeters so the glue is evenly distributed around the bearing in a race. Do the same for the second bearing, and again slide the bearing over the epoxy and then just back a couple of millimeters to evenly distribute the epoxy. This now positions the two bearings on the torque tube. It's now very important to let the epoxy dry. I've used 5-minute epoxy, so I'd like to leave this now for at least 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and attach the torque tube drive ends, the torque tube bearing supports, and insert the torque tube into the boom. After letting the 5-minute epoxy set, the next thing to do is slide on the bearing supports. These simply slide over each end of the torque tube and clip over the bearing. Check that the bearing is fully seated into the middle of the support. Next we are going to install the torque tube drive ends. These simply slide into the end of the torque tube and are secured using the supplied socket head cap screw and nylock nut. Here is the completed torque tube assembly. As you can see, I've installed the drive ends using the socket head cap screw and supplied nylock nut. We are now ready to install the torque tube into the boom. To allow easy insertion of the torque tube into the boom, it is best to coat the torque tube bearing supports with some grease. Here I'll use some ordinary silicone grease and just apply a generous amount to both rubber bushings. Next, we insert the torque tube into the boom, being careful to get the torque tube around the right way. The boom is identified at the front by the slot which goes into the front boom mount. The rear of the boom doesn't have any such slot. If we insert the torque tube from the front end, it's important the rear of the torque tube slides in first, and this is the end with the longest distance from the bearing to the end of the torque tube. We insert that into the boom and then gently fit the rubber bearing support into the boom and then slide the boom in. It's sometimes a good idea to move the boom backwards and forwards a little bit to allow for easy assembly. If you find the rubber is getting hard to push, simply take the torque tube out of the boom and apply a bit more grease. And now continue sliding the torque tube into the boom. It's really important you never push too hard, which might allow the rubber bushing to come off the bearing. So always just use gentle pressure, moving the torque tube backward and forward to let it slide into the boom. So here we have the completed assembly ready to go on the helicopter.